Next, Professor Farah Jasmine Griffin, who is one of great scholars of Toni Morrison, who will be also featured in tomorrow's film titled The Pieces I Am, will be giving us the keynote. Unfortunately, she will not be able to join us in person, but right after her keynote, which is sent to us as a recording, she will join the upcoming panel virtually via Zoom because she'll be having a discussion with a family member of the Africa Institute, Professor Mancha Diawara. That session will be moderated by Professor Salah Hassan. Professor Griffin is a professor of English, comparative literature, and African American studies. The keynote will be taking only 35 minutes. Right after that, we will conduct the panel. Enjoy the keynote. Thank you so much. Bless you. Bless you.
Good evening. My disappointment in not being there with you in person is only superseded by the honor I feel at having been asked to address you on this occasion. I want to thank Professor Hassan for the invitation and also Satan Al-Hassan for your kindness and your assistance. I wish I could be there in the presence of so many friends, especially Professors Margot Crawford, Mantia Diawara, Rashay Richardson, as well as others whom I do not know but look forward to meeting. And finally, I especially wish I could be there with my brother, Ford Morrison, as we celebrate the inauguration of this fellowship in honor of his mother and my beloved friend, Toni Morrison. However, caregiving responsibilities demand that I limit extensive travel at this time, and I'm thankful to all of you for accommodating me under these circumstances. But I am comforted in knowing that no one would have understood my need to prioritize the care of a loved one more than Toni herself, who in later novels like Home and God Help the Child wrote of caregiving as a spiritual practice. How appropriate that this newly launched Senior Fellowship in African Diaspora Literature and Cultural Studies here at the magnificent Africa Institute would be named for this extraordinary global intellectual, Toni Morrison. In my time with you today, I would like to use the opportunity of the inauguration of this fellowship, as well as the screening of the documentary The Foreigner's Home, to 1, chart the movement of her work from a focus on the ancestor to attention given to the stranger, the foreigner, the immigrant, and the relationship between the two. 2, to explore her understanding of her role as a global figure, as a calling to use her platform to call attention to the role of art and artists to ensuring that we live to the best of our humanity and to bear witness when we fall prey to its worst impulses. And 3, to encourage those of us who continue to be students of her work not only to look for its politics, but to also look for its moral implications and its ethical dimensions, to pursue the morality informing the work, which in turn shapes the ethics that emerge from it, to be as concerned about these things as we have been about its politics. The morality, a set of personal beliefs informed by the family, the community, and the religious training that informed her upbringing, a core sense of right and wrong which she valued and which helped shape and determine whether any system of rules or laws governing behaviors, any system of ethics was right or good. For she always sought the good, and it is this moral and ethical vision that would have been valued over and above and inform any sense of politics. I want to suggest here that she insists upon a practice, a way of living together, first as a small community of marginalized people in a segregated town or nation, but later as citizens sharing this planet. 1. On ancestors and strangers. Through her criticism and her fiction, Morrison has given us critical categories like the ancestor, and these writings have spawned an entire body of critical work. Starting with her essay, Rootedness, The Ancestor as Foundation, in 1984, through any number of essays and interviews, she has spoken about and prized the centrality and significance of the ancestor figure. In my very first book, Who Set You Flowing, I juxtaposed the ancestor, informed by Morrison, over and against the stranger, my conceptualization of the latter having been informed by thinkers like George Simmel, Richard Wright, and Julia Kristeva. Morrison noted, and I quote, that ancestors are a sort of timeless people whose relationships to characters are benevolent, instructive, protective, and they provide, she said, a certain kind of wisdom. I built upon Morrison's definition of the ancestor to see their presence in ritual, in religion, music, food, performance, in discursive formations and cultural forms. And in contrast, at the time, I thought the ancestor existed in a dialectical relationship to the stranger. Building upon Simmel, I saw the stranger as a cosmopolitan figure who was separate from the group, estranged from it, a kind of new personality created by human migration, identified by the sociologist Robert Park, as one who was released from tradition. But if Morrison was primarily interested in the ancestor in her earlier work, if there are ancestor figures who helped to shape and inform the direction of her narratives and her protagonists, like milkman, pilot, Setha, and others, later her interest, especially outside of her fiction, begins to turn toward the stranger. Actually, we can see the emergence of this interest as early as Tar Baby in 1981, but it comes fully into view later in her nonfiction essays and lectures, and I think culminating in the project The Foreigner's Home of 2006 and the film of the same name, which you have viewed, The Foreigner's Home, and even to some extent in the play Desdemona in 2011. Because what is Othello if not a foreigner or a stranger, as is Desdemona and Barbary? Furthermore, I think that this interest in the stranger is driven by an effort to articulate an understanding of globalization from the perspective of those who are impacted from the underside of it, those deemed foreigners, strangers, those unwelcomed at the gate. Finally, I want to suggest that she took up a sense of responsibility as someone with a voice and a position in many ways created by the impact of globalization to not speak on behalf of these populations, but to create a space where their voices might be heard. This movement from the ancestor to the stranger is not a movement away from a provincial focus on Black Americans or race to some more cosmopolitan emphasis, but instead it is an understanding that the birth of Black Americans is part of a long history of disruption and dislocation that is its own kind of globalization. It is an understanding that African Americans and peoples of African descent in the New World have always been strangers in the land of their birth. Let us turn our attention briefly to Morrison's Tar Baby, published in 1981 between her two most widely read books, Song of Solomon in 77 and Beloved in 87. If you've read Tar Baby, you may recall that it ends with Son, the major male character, having been taken by the blind Marie Therese on the far side joining the ancestor Maroons in the Caribbean mountains. But before he does so, Morrison tells us that starting in 1971, he spent 8 homeless years as part of what she says was a great underclass of undocumented men. And here in slide 1, you can see that closely. She says that he's part of that great underclass of undocumented men. And although there were more of his kind in the world than students or soldiers, unlike students or soldiers, they were not counted. They were an international legion of day laborers and muscle men, gamblers, sidewalk merchants, migrants, unlicensed crewmen on ships with volatile cargo, part-time mercenaries, full-time gigolos, or curbside musicians. What distinguished them from other men, aside from their terror of Social Security cards and cédula de identidad, was their refusal to equate work with life and an inability to stay anywhere for long. Some were Huck Finns, some nigger Jims, others were Calibans, Staggerlees, and John Henrys, anarchic, wandering. They read about their hometowns in the pages of out-of-town newspapers. These are stateless men, unaccounted and unaccounted for, ruled by no government or laws. They have an outsider's view and judgment of the land of their births. They are new, but not without history. They have a genealogy. They are the men of lore. They are fugitive men, men of the run, on the run, men of legend, folktale, and song. And I think for Morrison's imagination, they will be the figures unleashed by, or that help her to understand, the impact of globalization. Tar Baby may be the story of Sun and Jadine, but it may also be the story of 2 classes of individuals who are the subjects of the forces of globalization, who are made possible by it, both the descendants of enslaved Africans born in the New World, but with different fates and trajectories. Sun spends his time on ships with similar men, including the Mexican and the Swede. He jumps ship and swims in a sea that seems to welcome and caress him, easing his passage, and he ends up running on land toward ancestral spirits. Jadine, the bilingual, cosmopolitan, trained art historian and model, ends the novel in a jet plane, flying first class, heading toward a metropole. Paris is where she will have her choice of French men to marry, should she choose to marry. But she has concluded a grown woman did not need safety or its dreams. She was the safety she had longed for. Home, another novel published in 2012, Morrison's penultimate, which focuses on the Korean War. She was also thinking about the modern conditions that set people adrift, away from their homes, again in search of safe harbor, that set people apart. The brilliant, ever thoughtful, and always insightful and original Thaddeus Davis has written an essay on that novel, Going to Ground and Home, Morrison's mid-century political modernism. And here in slide 2, we see that Davis writes that in choosing to focus on the Korean War, quote, Morrison sees the emerging terrain of multilaterally linked industrial, military, capital, and intellectual complexes forming the modern world in a foundational period. She recognizes the later shifting allies and allegiances and the ensuing mobility of large populations worldwide in search of safety, security, and protection from persecution, war, genocide, or famine, end quote. So, as early as 1981, in her only novel, set primarily outside of the United States, Morrison is gesturing toward the dichotomies that will be wrought by the social and economic transformations of globalization. And over 2 decades later, toward the end of her literary career, these thoughts still concern her. In between the two works of fiction, they became crystallized in a series of lectures, essays, plays, and curatorial projects that accompany her as she takes up the mantle of global thinker, one of the most significant cultural public figures of her day, who will go on to use her position and her popularity to bring light to the humanity and plight of those deemed stranger, foreigner, or other. Excluding the height of the slave trade in the 19th century, the mass movement of peoples in the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st is greater now than it has ever been. It is a movement of workers, intellectuals, refugees, armies, crossing oceans, continents, immigrants, through customs offices and hidden routes, speaking multiple languages of trade, of political intervention, of persecution, violence, and poverty. This exact passage appears in 3 different essays republished in the Source of Self-Regard. I think she also says it in a lecture given during the Foreigner's Home residency at the Louvre. I am struck by the movement of the passage, that it starts with the height of the slave trade and the word excluding. She opens with a reminder that this movement of peoples, while massive, is not as large as that of the transatlantic slave trade. The sentence situates the presence in the context of a larger history, calls our attention to the fact that the disruptions of what we currently understand as globalism are not unique in human history, that in fact past forced migrations have resulted in the movements of a larger scale with extraordinary human cost and consequences. She then gives us the diversity of peoples who are in motion, the Jadines and the Sons, those moving for opportunities, those being moved because of lack of it at home, those being forced from their homes by war, by ecological and economic disaster, those who are counted and unaccounted, those who speak multiple languages, not only linguistically and culturally, but also multiple discourses, the discourses enabled and engendered by capitalism. Later, she will say, it is the flight of war refugees, the relocation and transplantation of the management and diplomatic class to globalization's outpost, as well as the deployment of fresh military units and bases. And she cites the efforts and attempts to control the constant flow of people. This, she says, is globalization narrowly defined, but there are other reasons: the instant movement of capital, the rapid distribution of data and products. She sees the larger connotations of globalization as less innocent because they include the demonization of embargoed states, the trivialization of peoples, of economies, of labor, the Americanization of the developed and developing world, all of which leads to the destabilization of culture and the turning of other peoples into others. She asks finally, who is the foreigner and what is home? These are most urgent questions and concerns. She asks, how do individuals resist or become complicit in the process of alienizing others' demonization, or process that can infect the foreigner's geographical sanctuary with the country's xenophobia, by welcoming immigrants or by importing slavers into their midst for economic reasons and relegating their children to a modern version of the undead? Or do we reduce an entire native population, some with a history of hundreds, even thousands of years long, into despised foreigners in their own country? I'll say that again because I think it's especially relevant in our own time. Even though she wrote it over a decade ago, it seems relevant even more now. She says, do we reduce an entire native population, some with a history hundreds, even thousands of years long, into despised foreigners in their own country? This is a lesson of history. This is a lesson of our moment now. This is how we have always dealt with the question of the foreigner, the stranger, or those we have made foreigner or stranger. At worst, she reminds us, walls, ammunition, they work for a while, but they are major failures over time. These solutions are what she sees as fascistic solutions, and they always lead to genocide. They're under consideration here and throughout the world at any given time in history. She ends the essay by saying, laws cannot stop them, nor can any God, and interventions merely provoke. And yet, this rather pessimistic closing seems out of character for Morrison. Might the later Morrison, having witnessed and studied history, really believe that interventions no longer make a difference? Certainly, she never stopped believing in the necessity of intervening and in the role of the arts in creating the most salient interventions, because she believed that the arts could remind us of shared histories, that they could insist that we bear witness and listen, for in every instance in history, people have produced art that told their stories, that insisted that they were here, that called attention to the slaughter and to the longing for home. In 2006, Toni Morrison guest curated an exhibition at the Louvre, which she called The Foreigner's Home. The exhibition included a series of public talks, conversations, performances with other artists, and throughout, her son Ford Morrison shot footage, which was later used for the film that he co-produced with directors Rian Brown and Jeff Pinegre, which you've had a chance to see. A film that shows, quote, art's redemptive power. Hers is not a claim that art will save the world, but that the world and its inhabitants are worth saving, and that artists who exist in every context across time and space and class and culture and border and boundary insist that people are worth saving. And during that residency, she brought not only well-established artists to the Louvre, but the street poets, the slam poets, the immigrant poets into the galleries of the Louvre and emboldened the space with their voices. She brought audiences to the immigrant neighborhoods and had the children share their poetry. And in her remarks in the Louvre, she asserted, "My faith in the world of art is not irrational and it is not naive. Art invites us to take the journey from data to information to wisdom. Artists make language, images, sound to bear witness, to shape beauty and to comprehend. My faith in their work exceeds my admiration for any other discourse. Such conversation with the public and among various genres of art and scholarship, this conversation is vital to our understanding of what it means to be human." No, she doesn't make claims that art will save us, but that it will provoke the necessary conversation that will force us to acknowledge each other's humanity. She curates these conversations in hopes of creating just that kind of encounter. The resulting project, organized around the painting, The Raft of the Medusa, showing survivors trying to stay alive after a shipwreck. For Morrison, an image reminding us of the multitudes set adrift on open seas in search of safe harbor, what she called, like nomads, between despair and hope, breath and death. Of course, for Morrison, African Americans, those strangers in their own land, the land they helped to build and make prosper. 2006, the year of the Louvre residency, was 1 year after those affected by Katrina were referred to as refugees, abandoned, set adrift in a flooded city. These foreigners, like foreigners everywhere, had already enriched the culture, the language, the cuisines of the place that did not welcome them. She says, after the please, please, please let us in, comes the other thing, the creative energy that is carried inside them. And it is this thrilling energy which animates the foreigner's home in the film which documented. The film and the trailer made from it finds Morrison asking, who is the foreigner? Am I the foreigner? A provocation. Because yes, of course, this beloved and revered author is part of a group of people, native sons and daughters in the land of their own birth, treated like foreigners, and a person of African descent, so also a foreign on the soil in which she asked that question. And yet here she stands as evidence of what she argues, that the immigrant, the foreigner, the stranger, the unwanted one, has brought their gifts and enriched the language, the culture, making it more vibrant, ensuring its longevity, bringing it alive, breathing new life, breath in the staid institutions, halls, and walkways of the host culture and the country that would reject them. This series of conversations, the interdisciplinary provocations, brought to life the urgent concern of people seeking shelter, now placing them in a long lineage. When Toni Cade Bambara drafted the screenplay for Tar Baby, the image with which she opened is A Black Man Swims. I have always believed Tar Baby to be Morrison's most cinematic novel, and the image A Black Man Swims is so evocative. We assume it is sun, but it could be so much. A lone black man in a vast ocean. Has he jumped off a slave ship? Is he a sailor for an expedition that precedes the transatlantic slave trade? Might he be a man swimming across the Ohio River from Kentucky to Ohio, from slavery to freedom? Is he one of the migrants from a capsized boat in the Caribbean Sea or the Atlantic, from Haiti trying to reach Florida, or North Africa trying to reach the shores of Italy, Greece, Spain, southern France? A black man swims. And here, years later, the filmmakers choose as a central motif for the film an animated ship from which we might imagine a black man swimming. Many years ago, sometime in the late 1990s or early 2000s, there was a conference at Princeton on Morrison's work, and she was teaching there, so she was in attendance. And I remember Juanima Lubiano giving a paper that wasn't about Morrison's writing on the topic of globalization, but she talked about Morrison and globalization. And she said something like that given all of the downsides of globalization and the exportation of American cultural hegemony, that the availability of Morrison's books and ideas, the ideas contained with them, that were made available as a result of American cultural hegemony, that availability might have a positive outcome. I've often thought about that talk. I've thought about Morrison's global stature and the availability of her novels worldwide, and I have seen translations of them everywhere I have traveled, in Europe and Asia and Latin America, as well as English language versions of them. I've seen scholarship on her work in Japanese, Spanish, German, Russian, Chinese, French. In fact, one of our favorite things to do was to find articles about her scholarship in different languages, and then I would have graduate students translate them for her so that they would be accessible to her to read. And I remember the love with which she was received, and what you can see here on these slides when she was in Paris for the Toni Morrison Circuits of the Imagination Conference in 2010. And David Carrasco recalls a similar reception when he accompanied her to Mexico. And now we have the inauguration of this fellowship. I think she would have been thrilled. I believe she took a sense of responsibility with this global recognition, a sense of responsibility most often recognized in ways that she spoke out on behalf of persecuted writers, particularly with her work with Penn, but also more and more in the growing attention that she gave to the treatment of the stranger and the foreigner, not a departure from her domestic concerns. As she entered the 21st century, especially in her projects outside of the novel, she extends her concerns with domestic racial issues and literary aesthetic with those with more global implications. And though, as I have suggested, we see these concerns evident early on in editorial projects that she took on, in anthologies that she edited on Third World writing and African writing, and in her correspondence, especially with Bombard, but in works created under her own name, in speeches and other projects, we begin to see it more and more in the later stages of her career. She doesn't shift her focus, but she builds upon it. She understands the conditions that lead to the contemporary fault lines of race and racism are the products of a modern world created in large part by the transatlantic slave trade and the developments of modernity and the rise of global capitalism. And while she broadens her focus from the specifically literary, she never ever veers from the primary importance of language and its power to construct our understanding of reality. She calls upon us to be attentive to history throughout the world, to remain vigilant for patterns of language that have paved the way for mass death, patterns of language that call people animals, that deem their land empty, that claim they have no history and culture worth recognizing. As intellectual and artists hailing from a people who have been subjected to all of this, she was especially sensitive to the power of this language and vigilant about and committed to exposing and challenging it wherever it appeared. She doesn't see this vigilance as only the responsibility of globally recognized figures of her stature, but all of us who claim to value humanity and freedom. Ultimately, this call of vigilance is neither pessimistic nor fatalistic, nor is it only political. In an early, little-known nonfiction essay, in fact, remarks made on a round table, Moral Inhabitants, 1976, she outlines what I think she will continue to see as the ultimate responsibility of all citizens of a society aspiring toward human freedom. After rehearsing painfully hateful language from some of the United States' most revered figures, language about blacks, Native Americans, immigrants, Jews, Chinese, everyone, after giving evidence of the cruelty and violence of these slave-holding statesmen, the ways that they have othered and made strangers of a great number of people, she said, "Our past is bleak, our future dim, but I am not reasonable. A reasonable man adjusts to his environment. An unreasonable man does not. All progress, therefore, depends on the unreasonable man. I prefer not to adjust to my environment. I refuse the prison of I and choose the open space of we. With such a past, we cannot be optimistic about the possibility of a humane society. We cannot be optimistic, but we can be clear." This is early Morrison, a year before Song of Solomon. But I think this is the Morrison we see in A Foreigner's Home. She is clear. She is clear about the past. She is clear about our responsibility to the present and clear about our responsibility to the future. And I think here, as always, she is inviting. She is inviting us to be part of the we, like the street poet that she brought to the Louvre. I see this as an invitation, this willingness to be vigilant, to challenge the tendencies of our world toward cruelty, greed, a willed ignorance and innocence, which is a refusal to become adjusted to things as they are and have been. It means we are clear-eyed that the future is not likely to be better, especially if we are not committed to making it so. It means we have to have a vision and a desire for a humane society, but more importantly, a willingness to work for it, and we have to be willing to build it. And for that, we need thinkers and readers and writers and artists and activists, and we need access to their work and their ideas. I want to leave you today with words that Morrison had as she closed those remarks in 1976. She said, "We are the moral inhabitants of the globe. To deny this regardless of our feeble attempts to live up to it, is to lie in prison. Of course there is cruelty. Cruelty is a mystery. But if we see the world as one long, brutal game, then we bump into another mystery, the mystery of beauty, of light. Unless all ages and all races of man have been diluted, there seems to be such a thing as grace, such a thing as beauty, such a thing as harmony, all wholly free and available to us. This, I think, is the legacy, or part of the legacy, she leaves for those of us who follow, who grapple with, who institutionalize her vision, a vision informed by her moral and ethical compass. Our past is bleak, our future may be dim, but we are moral beings, moral inhabitants of the earth, and it is a requirement that we act according to those ethical dimensions of the vision that she has left with us. Thank you.